My name is Alan, and I never imagined grief could be made worse by my own flesh and blood. The morning of my wife Margaret's funeral, I called my son hoping he would stand by me. Instead, he said words that cut deeper than the burial itself. Mom isn't coming back. But my wife's birthday is only once a year. That moment I realized I wasn't just burying my wife. I was burying every illusion I had about my son. What followed would change both of our lives forever in ways he never saw coming. Before we begin this story, I want to ask, where are you watching from, and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like this one. The phone felt heavy in my hand that morning, though I'd held it thousands of times before. My thumb hovered over the green button as I adjusted the knot of my black tie, the fabric tugging uncomfortably against my throat. It was Margaret's funeral day, a day I thought would bring my family together. Instead, it became the moment my family fell apart. I called my son Kyle at 8:30 a.m., praying he would at least arrive in time to carry his mother to her final rest. 4 rings, and then his voice answered, groggy but not grieving. Behind him came the blaring thump of music, followed by laughter, clinking glasses, and Megan's shrill voice complaining about party decorations. I gripped the phone tighter. "Son, it's Dad. The funeral starts at 11:30. I said, my voice tight with both grief and authority. There was a pause. Then Kyle cleared his throat as though I were bothering him. "Dad, I told you yesterday. Megan's birthday is tonight. We've been planning for months. Caterers, a live band, the whole thing. I can't just abandon her." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. My wife of 40 years, his mother, the woman who raised him with her last breath, was being laid to rest today. I steadied my voice. "Your mother's funeral happens once in a lifetime. Your wife's birthday happens every year." His answer came like ice water down my spine. "Mom's not coming back. But Megan only turns 32 once." The line went dead. I stood in the silent kitchen staring at Margaret's empty coffee cup still resting on the counter. Her lipstick faintly marked the rim. My wedding ring caught the morning sunlight she had always loved to see filter through the curtains she insisted on keeping spotless. And in that silence I realized I had lost not only my wife, but my son too. At 11:30 sharp, the church bell tolled. Friends, neighbors, and Margaret's garden club members filled the pews. Patricia, her sister, leaned close and whispered, "Where's Kyle?" Every face turned, waiting for the son who never came. My throat burned as I muttered important commitments. The words tasted bitter like ashes on my tongue. I carried my wife to her grave without him. Dirt fell on polished wood as the pastor spoke of eternal bonds. My eyes blurred not just from grief, but from the emptiness beside me, the place where Kyle should have stood. Mrs. Henderson, our longtime neighbor, whispered. She was so proud of that boy. I only nodded because if I spoke, my voice would betray the truth. I drove home alone, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Margaret's favorite song played on the radio, but I shut it off. Passing the manicured lawns of our street, I felt the crushing weight of 40 years of sacrifice for a son who valued champagne and balloons over his own mother's farewell. That night in the stillness of our home, I understood something had died with Margaret, besides love, my illusions about Kyle. When the cemetery crowd slowly dispersed, I lingered by Margaret's casket long after the others had gone. The cold March wind rustled the flowers piled on top, their colors already fading in the gray sky. I should have felt comfort surrounded by friends and neighbors, but all I could see was the empty space where my son should have stood. My heart ached as I imagined what Margaret would have said if she'd been there to witness it. She had defended Kyle all her life, even when he missed her chemo appointments, saying he's just busy, Alan. Young couples need their space. She always found an excuse for him. I wondered if she would have made one today, too. Back at the house, the silence pressed down heavier than the damp soil that covered her grave. I loosened my tie, dropped into my armchair, and stared across the room at our wedding photo. Margaret, at 23, radiant in her grandmother's dress, smiling as if life's storms would never touch us. We promised each other everything that day, and for 40 years we kept that promise. Except for the one thing I never imagined I'd fail at: raising a son who understood the meaning of love. I walked to the bedroom, searching for something of hers to hold. On the nightstand, I found her Bible bookmarks tucked into psalms she always read when life was heavy. As I opened it, a folded slip of paper slipped to the floor. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. In Margaret's familiar handwriting, it read, "My dearest Alan, please don't let Kyle forget us. We gave him everything we had. I hope that was enough. All my love, M." The words gutted me more than the funeral had. She had seen the truth too, hadn't she? She feared we might have raised a son who only loved what we could provide, not who we were. Tears blurred the ink as I held the note against my chest, feeling her voice echo in the emptiness. I opened the closet, searching for more. On the top shelf, hidden beneath old blankets, I discovered a box I'd never noticed before. Inside were Kyle's report cards, carefully preserved from kindergarten through college. Each one bore Margaret's notes in the margins, so proud. Our brilliant boy. She had saved every piece of paper, every photo, every reminder of the boy she believed in. Looking through them felt like peeling back the year's birthday parties decorated with paper streamers we made by hand, because we couldn't afford store-bought late nights when she worked double shifts, while I poured concrete for the construction company. All of it for Kyle's future. But now that future looked like a mockery. I sat at my desk, pulled out a calculator, and began adding up what we had given him. Tuition cars, house down payment, wedding expenses, emergency loans, one figure after another, until the total glared at me in cold numbers: $147,000, nearly $1 million, all poured into a son who couldn't give his mother 3 hours of his time. The wind rattled the windows as I whispered into the silence, "Margaret, we gave him everything, and he gave us nothing in return." The number on the calculator screen wouldn't stop burning into my mind: $804,000, nearly $1 million. I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking beneath me, and let the figure sink in. My father had given me nothing but the advice to make my own way. "Build your character, not your excuses," he used to say. Harsh words from a hard man, but I respected them. And now, comparing his lessons to what I had done for Kyle, I wondered if I'd mistaken indulgence for love. I turned the light off and walked into the kitchen, but the house felt hollow, more museum than home. Margaret's coffee mug still sat in the dishwasher, a faint ring at the bottom where she'd left her last sip. Her romance novel lay open on her nightstand, a bookmark still waiting for her to return. Even the curtains seemed to sag without her fussing over them. Everywhere I looked, reminders of what we had built together stared back, and yet the one thing we had poured our lives into, the boy we called our pride, hadn't even shown up to say goodbye. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Margaret's words from the note echoed in my mind. Don't let Kyle forget us. But hadn't he already forgotten he hadn't been there for her chemo appointments? He hadn't been there when she begged him to spend Thanksgiving with us, and now he wasn't there for her final farewell. What would it take for him to finally remember what family meant? Sleep never came. Instead, I rose before dawn, dressed, and sat at my desk again. I pulled out folders, bank statements, every record of the life we had quietly sacrificed for him. One by one, I spread them across the desk, like evidence in a trial. Tuition checks, mortgage co-signatures, medical bills delayed so he could buy a new car. Margaret's own handwriting appeared again in a small notebook, her private ledger of the sacrifices she never told him about. Postponed anniversary dinner, Kyle needed $5,000 for car repairs. Bought generic groceries, sent Kyle money for Megan's birthday. Skipped doctor visit, Kyle's wedding costs exceeded budget. I read those lines until my hands trembled. Margaret had given up her health, her comfort, even her dignity just to see him smile. And he had paid her back by ignoring her final day on earth. As dawn painted the sky with pale light, my grief hardened into something colder. I wasn't going to beg for his love anymore. I wasn't going to write another check just to be treated like a wallet. The truth struck me like thunder. Margaret had been too kind, and I had been too blind. That cycle ended now. I closed the folders, stacked them neatly, and placed Margaret's note on top. Don't let Kyle forget us. Well, he wouldn't forget, not this time. My decision was made. The funeral might have buried Margaret, but from this day forward I would bury my illusions about Kyle. And just as I whispered that vow to myself, the phone rang. His name lit up the screen. Kyle. The screen glowed with his name, and for a long moment I only stared at it. Kyle. The son who had skipped his mother's burial less than 24 hours earlier. My chest tightened as I answered, already bracing for more excuses. "Hey, Dad," he said, his tone casual, even cheerful, as if we'd spoken yesterday about the weather. I could hear clattering dishes and Megan's laughter in the background. "Hope you're holding up after you know everything." Everything. That's what he called his mother's funeral, everything. I didn't reply. Silence stretched until he filled it the way he always did when he wanted something. "So listen," his voice perked up. "Megan's party was amazing, but we went a little over budget. You know how it is, big steakhouse dinner, live band, diamond bracelet for her. She deserves the best." I clenched the receiver so tightly my knuckles popped. He hadn't even mentioned Margaret by name. Not once. Instead, he launched straight into his request. "We're looking at about $15,000 in bills, Dad. Could you just wire it today? Megan's stressed out, and you know how she gets when she worries." The audacity left me breathless. My wife's grave was still fresh, the flowers not yet wilted, and here was my son asking me for money for a party. I swallowed hard. My whole life I had never told him no. From his first car to his down payment, from tuition to emergencies, I had always found a way. Margaret and I had always folded under his pleas, telling ourselves it was what family did. But now the weight of Margaret's note pressed against my memory. I hoped that was enough. I heard my own voice, low and steady, before I even realized I was speaking. "No." There was a pause on the other end, as if the word didn't translate. "What do you mean, no? Is there a problem with the bank, no, Kyle?" I repeated louder this time. "I mean, no. I won't be giving you any more money." The cheer drained from his tone. "Dad, come on. Don't be like that. Mom just died, and now you're going to get petty about money. She'd want you to help us." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, it might have worked once. But not today. "Your mother wanted you at her funeral," I said, each word sharp enough to cut. He drew a sharp breath. "Fine. We'll figure this out ourselves. But don't expect us to come around much anymore if this is how it's going to be." For 35 years, that threat had worked. His presence dangled like a reward, his absence like punishment. But this time I felt nothing but clarity. "I understand," I said calmly. "You what I understand. Take care, Kyle." I ended the call. The silence that followed was unlike any I'd ever known. Not empty, not weak, liberating. For the first time in decades, I had ended a conversation with my son on my terms. I set the phone down and looked at Margaret's picture on my desk. "It's finished," I whispered. But in my heart, I knew this was only the beginning. The house seemed to breathe with me after I hung up every tick of the kitchen clock, marking the moment my life shifted. For 35 years, I had been the man who never said no to his son. In one syllable, I had become someone else. I stood pacing the living room, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood Margaret had polished each spring. A part of me expected the phone to ring again, Kyle apologizing, begging forgiveness. Instead, silence lingered, thick and final. I poured myself a cup of coffee, though it went cold before I ever touched it. My mind replayed the conversation in sharp fragments, his cheerful tone, the word petty, the casual way he used Margaret's death as leverage. Every memory hardened into resolve. I would no longer bankroll a man who valued balloons and steak dinners over his mother's last breath. The next morning, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I shaved, dressed in my best suit, and drove to Foster Construction 2 hours earlier than usual. The lobby smelled of fresh coffee and new carpet, but it felt different now. I wasn't just Alan the father. I was Alan the builder, the man who had poured 40 years into creating something solid, something lasting. And Kyle had been treating it like his playground. In my office, I spread his personnel file across the desk. 8 years of missed deadlines, padded expense reports, client complaints, all documented in neat handwriting by Sarah Mitchell, my HR director. She'd been waiting for me to see what she already knew: Kyle wasn't an asset. He was a liability. Reading through the reports, I felt a slow burn rise in my chest. If any other employee had a record like this, they would have been gone years ago. I had let family blind me. The intercom buzzed. Sarah's voice was steady. "Mr. Foster, shall I prepare the paperwork?" "Yes," I said. My voice carried a firmness that surprised even me. "And arrange for security. This will be by the book." I stood before the office mirror, rehearsing the words I had never imagined saying. "Your employment with Foster Construction is terminated effective immediately." My reflection stared back. Not a grieving father, not a man crushed by betrayal, but a leader ready to reclaim his authority. At 9:30, Kyle strolled in, 15 minutes late, coffee in hand, laughing with the receptionist about his hangover from Megan's party. The sound of his laughter sliced through the quiet hallways like an insult. My finger pressed the intercom. "Kyle, please come to my office immediately." His casual response floated back. "Sure, Dad. Just let me grab my coffee." Now Kyle. The silence that followed told me he'd heard the difference in my tone. His footsteps grew heavier as they approached. When he opened the door and saw Sarah with a folder in her hands, confusion flickered across his face. "What's all this?" he asked, still trying to sound casual. I folded my hands on the desk. "Kyle, your employment with Foster Construction is terminated effective immediately." For the first time, I watched the mask of entitlement slip, and for the first time, I felt no guilt at all. Kyle froze in the doorway, his smile twitching into something brittle. For a second, he actually laughed the way a child does when he thinks the parent is joking. "Very funny, Dad. What's this really about?" His eyes darted from my face to Sarah's steady hands clutching the folder. "It's not a joke," I said, my voice flat. "Please sit down." He didn't move. "Come on, Dad. Megan's waiting downstairs. Just give me the documents you need me to sign for payroll or whatever. This whole setup feels ridiculous." I slid the termination papers across the desk. "Review these and sign where indicated. You are no longer employed here." The papers seemed to burn his fingers as he picked them up. His eyes flicked over the legal language, and I watched color drain from his face. You can't be serious. This is the family business. Mom would never let you do this. I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't let him pull me back into guilt. Your employment is being terminated for performance-related reasons. 8 years of negligence complaints and inflated expenses. Any other employee would have been fired long ago. This company can't carry you anymore. Kyle's voice cracked. Dad, you don't mean this. I know I messed up yesterday, but you can't destroy my career over one bad choice. One bad choice. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. You abandoned your mother's funeral. That was the last straw, Kyle. But this, I tapped the folder of records. This is years of bad choices. I looked the other way because of your mother. That ends today. His mask cracked further. Megan will never forgive you for this. You're tearing this family apart. The words rolled off me like water. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. As if on cue, Mike Thompson, our head of security, appeared in the doorway. Calm, professional, but unyielding. Kyle's bravado melted into desperation. Dad, please, we can work this out. Just give me another chance. I stood, adjusting my suit jacket. This is a business decision, not a personal one. Your time here is over. For a moment, the office was silent except for the sound of Kyle's shallow breathing. He finally snatched his coffee mug from the desk along with a framed photo of Megan and shoved past Mike. His shoulders hunched as whispers followed him down the hallway. Employees watched their eyes wide, realizing that the boss's son was no longer untouchable. Through the glass wall of my office, I saw Kyle shove his things into a box, his face twisted with humiliation. Megan's voice carried from the lobby, sharp and demanding. What do you mean he's been fired? This is his company too. Within moments, she stormed into the hallway, pointing a manicured finger toward my office. You'll regret this, Allen's security intercepted her before she could burst in. I didn't rise from my chair. I simply folded Kyle's file, placed it neatly in my desk drawer, and closed it with finality. For the first time in my life, I had treated my son not as a spoiled heir, but as the failed employee he had become. And the strange thing was, it felt right. I stayed seated long after Kyle had been escorted out, the silence of my office heavier than any funeral hymn. For decades, I had imagined this building as his legacy. Foster Construction was supposed to pass from my hands into his, like a torch carried across generations. But as I watched him storm away with a cardboard box of trinkets, I realized I hadn't raised a builder. I'd raised a man who thought walls would hold themselves up if he just smiled at them. The HR director, Sarah Mitchell, returned a few minutes later with the signed paperwork. She set it on my desk gently, like laying down a verdict. It's done, she said softly. All access codes revoked, company accounts disabled, computer locked. He no longer has a foothold here. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the empty spot on the management wall where his photo had hung. Thank you, Sarah. Make sure the team knows business goes on as usual. They've seen too much weakness from me already. When she left, I stood and walked down the hallway. Employees avoided my eyes, but I could feel their relief, almost like a sigh running through the building. They had tolerated Kyle's long lunches, his sloppy oversight, his arrogance because he was my son. Now they saw that even he wasn't above accountability. A strange pride flickered in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, they'd respect me more for this. By lunchtime, word had spread beyond the office. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues in town. Some were shocked, others quietly supportive. Tough move, Allen, but the right one contractor wrote. Another simply texted, about time. Their responses only confirmed what I already knew: Kyle had been failing for years, and I had been the only one blind to it. At home that evening, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat in Margaret's floral chair, the one she had always claimed as hers. For years, I had let her compassion temper my decisions with Kyle. She believed in second chances, in forgiveness, in giving him the benefit of the doubt. I had gone along with it even when it meant sacrificing more than we could afford. But now she was gone, and her words on that hidden note haunted me. I hoped that was enough. Enough, I thought bitterly. We gave him everything, and it still wasn't enough. The phone rang again. Kyle's name flashed across the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice was sharp, wounded, stripped of the fake cheer. You humiliated me today. Everyone saw it. You think you can just erase me from the company? I'll talk to a lawyer. I'll sue for wrongful termination. I let him rant his words, spilling fast and furious. When he paused for breath, I spoke calmly. Kyle, you were an at-will employee. Your record speaks for itself. You'll find no lawyer willing to argue your case. Silence. Then his voice dropped to a venomous hiss. Mom would be ashamed of you. That line, meant to pierce me, only steeled my resolve. No, Kyle. She would be ashamed of you. She defended you until her dying breath, and you couldn't give her the dignity of your presence at her funeral. I ended the call before he could respond. For the first time, I felt Margaret's hand on my shoulder, not urging me to protect him, but to stand firm. The next morning, I arrived at the office before sunrise. My reflection in the glass doors looked older, yes, but steadier too. For years, I had told myself family loyalty came before everything. Now I understood the truth. Loyalty without accountability was nothing more than enabling. I spread Kyle's employment file across my desk once again, though I hardly needed to. The pages told the story I already knew: projects delayed because he didn't show up on-site, vendor complaints, ignored invoices padded for business meals that looked suspiciously like nights out with friends. I wondered how many employees had silently cursed my blindness, how many opportunities we had lost, because I couldn't see what Kyle had become. Sarah Mitchell stepped into the office, coffee in hand. She looked tired, but resolute. Alan, I've drafted the official memo for staff. Would you like me to circulate it? Yes, I said, but keep it simple. We're moving forward with restructuring. No mention of family ties. Her eyes softened. You did the right thing yesterday. I almost smiled. Funny thing, Sarah. It didn't feel like the right thing. It felt like the only thing left to do. By 9 o'clock, I had a call scheduled with one of our largest clients. They'd had repeated frustrations with Kyle, though they'd been too polite to say it outright. When I explained that he was no longer with the company, there was a pause, then a relieved chuckle. Glad to hear it, Alan. We've always respected you, but between us, your son wasn't exactly following in your footsteps. That validation cut sharper than Kyle's accusations ever could. My clients, my employees, even my competitors had seen what I'd been too stubborn to admit. Kyle wasn't a leader, he was a liability. At home that night, the house felt different. Quieter, yes, but not the suffocating silence I'd felt after the funeral. This quiet was lighter, as though Margaret herself had breathed out a long-held sigh of relief. I walked into her garden, pruning shears in hand, and clipped a few roses she had always fussed over more than any jewel. As I arranged them in a vase on the kitchen table, I whispered, I finally did what you couldn't, Margaret. I told him no. But Kyle wasn't finished. The phone rang after dark. This time his voice wasn't pleading or angry, it was calculating. You think you can just cut me off? You forget dad people talk. Word gets out fast. What will it look like when I tell everyone you fired your own son 2 days after Mom's funeral? When I say you've lost your mind, that grief made you unstable? His threat hung like smoke in the air. For decades, I had let his words control me, twisting guilt into action. But something had shifted in me. I leaned back in my chair and said evenly, You can tell them whatever you like, Kyle. I don't fear the truth. He slammed the phone down, but the sound didn't shake me. It only confirmed what I already knew: my son's love had always been conditional, tied to what he could take. And now that the supply was gone, so was his mask. 2 days after the firing, I arrived at the office to find a commotion brewing in the lobby. Megan's voice carried across the marble floor, sharp and shrill like nails raked down glass. You can't do this to Kyle. This is his company too. We've given our lives to foster construction. Employees lingered near the receptionist's desk, whispering, watching the spectacle unfold. Megan's perfectly styled hair bobbed as she jabbed a finger at Sarah Mitchell, who stood calm but firm. Behind her, Kyle shifted uneasily, his face pale. He didn't look like a man ready to defend himself. He looked like a boy caught between his wife's fury and his father's judgment. I stepped out of my office and crossed the lobby slowly, every heel click echoing like a gavel. This is not the place for theatrics, I said evenly. Megan whirled around, her eyes blazing. Not the place. You humiliated him in front of everyone. After his mother died, you destroy his career. You owe us 6 months severance. At the very least, I folded my arms. Kyle was an at-will employee. His performance record is documented. No severance is required. Her face twisted with fury. Don't play games with me. I know the law. We'll sue for wrongful termination. We'll sue for our share of Margaret's estate. You think you can just erase us? Her words were daggers, but I didn't flinch. I simply nodded to Mike Thompson, our head of security, who was already watching from the side. Escort Mrs. Foster out, I instructed. Megan's shriek filled the building. Margaret would be ashamed of you. You're nothing but a bitter old man lashing out at your son because you're too weak to face your grief. I saw Kyle wince at her words, but he didn't stop her. That silence told me more than any defense ever could. Employees gathered along the hallway, watching Megan thrash against security's firm but careful grip. Some looked stunned, others almost relieved, as though they had waited years for this curtain to drop. Kyle's humiliation deepened with every pair of eyes on him. He bent his head, avoiding their stares, as his wife was escorted out, kicking and screaming. When the doors finally shut behind her, the silence in the lobby was deafening. Kyle lingered, his eyes darting from the closed doors to me. Dad. Please, he whispered, barely audible. We can fix this. Don't let her words ruin everything. I looked at him, at the man who bore my last name but none of my values. She didn't ruin anything, Kyle. You did. And you did it long before today. His shoulders sagged, his coffee mug trembling in his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, knowing there was nothing left to argue. Slowly he turned and walked out through the same doors that had swallowed Megan. I watched him go, not as a father watching his son leave, but as a man watching a chapter close. When the glass doors finally shut behind Kyle, the building seemed to exhale. Employees drifted back to their desks, though I could still feel their eyes on me, the quiet murmurs of relief passing through the hallways. For years they had endured his arrogance because of my silence. Now they had seen what I should have done long ago: hold my son accountable. I returned to my office, closed the door, and sat at my desk. My hands trembled slightly as I folded his termination papers into the file drawer. It wasn't nerves, it was the weight of 40 years pressing down, colliding with the realization that the hardest step had already been taken. Margaret used to tell me that the first no would be the hardest. She was right. It felt as if I had pried open a rusted lock that had kept me chained to Kyle's whims. Now the chain lay broken. The phone rang. His name lit up the caller ID again, stubborn as ever. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Dad, Kyle's voice was low, almost trembling. You didn't have to embarrass me like that. We could have handled this privately. You embarrassed yourself, I replied. Years of laziness and excuses caught up to you. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences. He hesitated. You've ruined my reputation. Everyone's talking. Megan's furious. Do you really want to make us enemies? His threat carried less weight than he imagined. Kyle, I said carefully, you made that choice when you put Megan's birthday above your mother's funeral. There was a long silence. Then his voice turned cold. If you're cutting me off, then don't expect us to be around anymore. No birthdays, no holidays, no visits. You'll die alone in that big house. For years, those words would have shaken me. But not anymore. I've been alone since the day your mother died, I said quietly. The difference is, I can live with that. Can you? He slammed the line dead. I set the receiver down gently, the silence afterward more peaceful than painful. For the first time, I felt as though Margaret herself was in the room with me, whispering approval. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. As I walked past the lobby, Kyle's photo still hung on the management wall, smiling in the suit I'd bought him. I paused, lifted it off the hook, and carried it back to my office. Setting it face down in the drawer beside his file, I closed it with a click that sounded like a final nail sealing a coffin. I stood by the window overlooking the city I had helped build with my own hands. For decades I had confused enabling with love. Now I understood the truth. Real love sometimes meant letting someone fall. And as the sun rose over Davenport, I felt a new chapter unfolding. Kyle thought he had seen the worst of me. He hadn't, because the man who once gave him everything had finally learned how to take it all away. I knew it wouldn't be long before Kyle tried to strike back. My son had never accepted the word no, and I doubted he would start now. Sure enough, 3 days after the firing, Megan arrived at my doorstep uninvited, her high heels snapping against the porch steps like gunshots. She didn't knock. She stormed in as though the house already belonged to her. "You've lost your mind, Alan," she hissed, tossing her designer purse onto my couch. "Firing Kyle right after his mother's death. Do you have any idea how cruel that looks?" I remained seated in my armchair, hands folded calmly. "What looks cruel," I replied evenly, "is a son who skipped his mother's funeral for champagne and cake." Her face flushed crimson, but she pressed forward. "You think people won't notice Davenport is already buzzing with your behavior? Everyone's talking about how grief has broken you, how you're lashing out irrationally. If you don't reverse this, we'll go to court. Kyle is entitled to half of everything Margaret left behind." The audacity of her words cut deeper than the threat itself. Margaret's jewelry, her books, even her wedding ring still sat in our home, and Megan dared to speak of entitlement. Before I could respond, Kyle slipped through the doorway, his voice softer, rehearsed. "Dad, let's not escalate things. We just want what's fair. You know Mom wouldn't want us fighting like this. Fair." The word rang hollow. I thought of Margaret's note of her hidden ledger of sacrifices. Fair had been every double shift she worked, every doctor's visit. She postponed every anniversary dinner, canceled to cover their emergencies. And still, they stood here demanding more. "You've already had your share, Kyle," I said, my voice firm. "Nearly $1 million of it, and you wasted it. There is nothing more for you to take." His eyes narrowed, his mask slipping. "We'll see what a judge has to say about that. Wrongful termination, inheritance disputes. You can't keep us out forever. People will start asking questions." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "Let them. I've buried the woman I loved. There's nothing left you can threaten me with." Megan scoffed, grabbing Kyle's arm. "You'll regret this, Alan. You'll die alone and no one will even remember your name." They stormed out together, leaving the door wide open behind them. I rose, closed it softly, and stood in the quiet. Their threats no longer rattled me. But I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. They would try to claw their way back into what they thought they were owed. As I locked the door, I looked at Margaret's photo on the mantel. "They'll come for me, my love," I whispered. "But this time I'll be ready." The attack didn't come in the form of lawyers or court summons, not at first. It came in whispers, in the kind of small-town gossip that spreads faster than truth. Davenport had always been a place where reputations lived or died over coffee at the diner or a round of golf at the country club. And Kyle knew it. The first sign was at Sunday service. I stood at the end of the pew, Margaret's Bible clutched in my hands, when a woman I'd known for 30 years leaned in and asked Alan, "Is it true you fired Kyle right after Margaret's funeral?" Her tone carried pity, but her eyes carried judgment. I answered simply, "It's true," and left it at that. But I knew then where the rumor had started. By Monday, the whispers had grown teeth. At the hardware store, men I'd built houses alongside for decades suddenly avoided my eyes. At the country club, my usual foursome canceled with polite excuses. It didn't take long before the story reached me. Kyle was telling anyone who would listen that I was losing it, that grief had made me irrational, that I was tearing down my own family in a fit of bitterness. Megan, meanwhile, played the grieving daughter-in-law, lamenting how cruelly she and Kyle were treated after all the sacrifices they made for Margaret. I should have been furious, but I wasn't. For the first time in years, I saw their desperation clearly. They were trying to use the only weapon they had left: other people's opinions. They thought shame would make me retreat, as it always had before. But Margaret's absence had changed me. Her words in that note, "I hope that was enough," echoed every time I heard a whisper. Enough was enough. Still, the sting was real. When I stopped by Romano's restaurant, the maitre d', who had always greeted Margaret and me with a smile, suddenly looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Foster. We don't have a table available tonight." I glanced at the half-empty dining room and knew it wasn't about availability. It was about perception. Davenport's polite society was already starting to distance itself from me. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, Margaret's roses filling the vase in front of me, and I weighed my next move. My instinct was to retreat, to let the storm pass. But then I remembered how Kyle had skipped his mother's funeral, how Megan had barged into my office demanding money as though it were her birthright. These were not misunderstandings, they were choices, and choices carried consequences. I decided then that if Kyle and Megan wanted to play their game in the court of public opinion, I would let the truth speak louder than their lies. Not with shouting, not with threats, but with a steady unveiling of facts. People in Davenport valued family loyalty, respect for the dead. And once they knew what Kyle had really done, his reputation would collapse faster than mine ever could. I leaned back, looking at Margaret's picture on the mantel. "You always believed the truth would win in the end," I whispered. "Let's make sure it does." The opportunity came sooner than I expected. At the Davenport Country Club, where Margaret and I had attended countless charity dinners, I was invited to the monthly board meeting. Normally, it was routine business budgets, maintenance reports, fundraising updates. But that night, as I walked into the oak-paneled room, every head turned. I could feel the question hanging in the air before anyone spoke. William Hayes, the board president, cleared his throat. "Alan, forgive me for asking, but people are saying you fired Kyle just days after Margaret's passing. Is it true?" His voice wasn't accusatory, more cautious, as though he wanted to give me a chance to defend myself. I set my briefcase on the table and looked around the room. These were men and women who had known Margaret for decades, who had eaten her casseroles at church potlucks, who had watched Kyle grow up. I took a breath. Yes, it's true. I dismissed Kyle from foster construction. Murmurs rippled across the room. I held up my hand. And let me tell you why. On the morning of Margaret's funeral, I called my son to remind him of the service. Do you know what he told me? He said his wife's birthday was more important. He skipped his mother's burial to throw a party. The room went still. A few jaws dropped. One woman gasped audibly. Patricia Morton, Margaret's sister, whispered, "Good Lord." I continued, my voice steady. For years, Margaret and I gave everything to Kyle: education, a house, even his wedding. Nearly $1 million in total. We believed we were building his future. But when it came time to honor the woman who sacrificed her life for him, he wasn't there. That was the moment I stopped making excuses. The silence that followed was heavier than any hammer I'd ever lifted. William Hayes leaned back slowly, his face hardening. That explains a lot. By the time I left the meeting, I knew the truth had begun its march. Davenport was small, and its social circles even smaller. Within days, the story had spread. I didn't have to say another word. The bridge club picked it up, then the church ladies, then the businessmen at Romano's. Whispers turned into outrage, outrage into cold shoulders directed at Kyle and Megan. I saw the fallout firsthand. On Saturday morning, I stopped by the golf course. Kyle's usual foursome, a group of men who had tolerated him out of respect for me, was already halfway through a round without him. When he approached them, golf bags slung over his shoulder, they avoided his eyes. "Sorry, Kyle," one muttered. "We've got a full group today." They didn't. Later that week, Megan's name was removed from the reservation list at her yoga studio. The instructor told her flatly, "We prefer members who value family." The words stung her more than any bill ever could. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The community was doing what I could never have done alone, holding them accountable. Margaret had always said, "The truth has a way of planting itself." She was right. As I walked home that evening, I looked up at the sky and whispered, "They finally know who he really is, Margaret, and who you really were." The tide in Davenport turned faster than I imagined. Within a week, Kyle and Megan were no longer the golden couple strutting through town. They were pariahs whispered about in grocery aisles, ignored at restaurants, quietly shunned by people who once fawned over them. And the beauty of it was, I didn't lift a finger. On Tuesday afternoon, I heard from an old friend at Romano's restaurant. He told me Kyle had shown up for lunch, only to be informed his reservation had been lost. The maitre d' apologized politely, but never offered him a table. Kyle stormed out red-faced, while half the dining room pretended not to watch. Later that week, Megan's credit application at Bergdorf's boutique was mysteriously delayed, leaving her humiliated at the counter. Davenport society had made its judgment: when you dishonor family, you dishonor yourself. But gossip was only the beginning. I knew Kyle and Megan still had one lifeline: money. Over the years, I had co-signed mortgages, backed loans, and guaranteed credit lines to keep their lifestyle afloat. It was time to cut the last ropes, tying them to my name. I scheduled a meeting with Robert Chen, my longtime attorney. His office, perched on the top floor of Davenport's tallest building, overlooked the Mississippi River. He rose when I entered, clasping my hand firmly. "Alan," he said, his voice filled with concern, "I've heard the rumors. Tell me what's really happening." I explained everything: Margaret's funeral, Kyle's absence, his demand for money the very next day, and the way he and Megan had turned the town into their stage. Robert listened carefully, his jaw tightening as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back. "It's time to protect what's yours, Alan. Not just for your sake, but for Margaret's memory." I slid a folder across his desk. Inside were copies of every loan, every guarantee, every financial tie binding me to Kyle. I want to unwind it all, I said. Remove my name, cancel my guarantees, cut every thread that connects him to my accounts. Robert studied the documents, then nodded slowly. We can do it. Some of these require 30 days' notice, but the law is on your side. Once you withdraw, the bank will have no choice but to hold Kyle responsible. For the first time since Margaret's passing, I felt something close to peace. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. If Kyle wanted to live like an adult, then he could shoulder the debts of one. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Margaret's picture beside me. I'm doing this for you, I whispered. No more sacrifices for a son who never learned gratitude. Through the window, I could see the lights from Kyle's house across town, bright, loud, alive, with the life Margaret and I had built for him. Soon, those lights would dim. Not because I flipped the switch, but because I finally stopped paying the bill. And when that day came, the silence on their street would echo the silence I felt the morning of her funeral. The next morning, I walked through the marble lobby of First National Bank with a calm I hadn't felt in years. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating oil portraits of Davenport's founding families. Men who had built this town with their bare hands stared down at me, and for the first time, I felt I belonged among them, not because of wealth, but because I had finally learned to stand firm. David Harrison, the bank manager, greeted me nervously in his corner office. He glanced at the stack of files under my arm, his expression already uneasy. Alan, thank you for coming in. I'm afraid there's an issue with Kyle's mortgage payments. He's 2 months behind. The delinquent amount is over $18,000. I set the folder on his desk, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I'm aware. That's why I'm here. I'm withdrawing my guarantee. His eyebrows shot up. Withdrawing, Alan, you've guaranteed this loan for 8 years. Without your backing, foreclosure proceedings would have to begin. I met his eyes without blinking. Then begin them. For a moment he was silent, his fingers drumming against the desk. You understand, this could ruin Kyle financially. He'll lose the house. He already lost something more important, I said quietly. He lost his mother, and he couldn't bother to stand by her grave. A man who abandons family shouldn't keep a house built on family sacrifice. David hesitated, then dialed the bank's legal department on speaker. A voice confirmed what Robert Chen had already assured me: I had the legal right to withdraw as guarantor, provided I gave written notice. I slid the prepared documents across the desk. My signature was already inked at the bottom. When the call ended, David sighed, his face pale. Very well. The process will move forward immediately. I stood, straightened my jacket, and offered a hand he barely had the courage to shake. Do it quickly. Dragging it out won't help anyone. As I walked out of the bank, I felt the crisp autumn air cut across my face. For years, I had dreaded the day Kyle might collapse under the weight of his own irresponsibility. Now I realized he needed to. Only consequences would strip away the entitlement Margaret and I had allowed to grow like ivy. That evening, I sat in the garden pruning the roses Margaret had loved. I imagined her voice in the rustle of the leaves, steady and kind. You did what had to be done, Alan. Across town, Kyle and Megan were preparing for another night out, oblivious to the storm on the horizon. They had no idea the safety net had been cut. No idea the home they flaunted to neighbors would soon be up for auction. I clipped another rose, its petals falling softly into the dirt. Justice didn't always come with thunder or fire. Sometimes it arrived in quiet signatures on a banker's desk. And with that stroke of a pen, I had delivered the blow that would end their charade once and for all. The first real cracks appeared a month later. I heard about it not from Kyle himself, but from a neighbor who stopped me outside the Morning Glory diner. "Alan," she said softly. I saw a foreclosure notice posted on Kyle's front door. Her voice carried the sympathy people reserve for tragedies, but beneath it I detected something else: disapproval. Not for me, but for him. That evening, I drove past Maple Avenue. Their four-bedroom colonial sat in darkness blinds, drawn the once pristine lawn, littered with leaves no one had bothered to rake. A bright orange paper flapped against the front door in the wind, notice of foreclosure proceedings. For years, Margaret and I had poured money into that house. Our money, not theirs. Now it stood as a monument to entitlement waiting to be reclaimed by the bank. Inside my car, I watched as Megan stormed out the front door, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice shrill enough to cut through the glass. Kyle trailed behind her head, down a shell of the confident man who used to brag about his family business. I couldn't hear her words, but I didn't need to. I'd seen that look before, the look of someone realizing the ground beneath them was no longer theirs to stand on. The next morning, David Harrison from the bank called to confirm. "Mr. Foster, we've officially filed foreclosure. Unless the debt is settled within 30 days, the property will go to auction." His voice carried the professional detachment of a man doing his job, but I could sense the weight behind it. He knew Kyle was finished. When I hung up, I sat at my desk, Margaret's photo beside me. I traced her smile with my fingertip and whispered, "He never deserved that house, Margaret. You built it. You earned it. And now it will go to someone who knows the meaning of family." The fallout was immediate. Megan's social circle evaporated almost overnight. Friends who once gathered in her kitchen for wine nights now avoided her calls. Her yoga studio banned her from classes citing family values. Even her favorite salon canceled her appointments. When she tried to open a new credit line to cover expenses, the clerk's polite smile hardened as soon as the system flagged her name. Kyle didn't fare any better. He showed up at the Chamber of Commerce luncheon, trying to charm his way into a new job. But the moment he walked in, conversations grew stiff, chairs shifted away, and no one invited him to sit. Davenport had already passed judgment: if you abandon your mother's funeral for a party, you don't belong among them. At night, I would sit by the window and sip tea, watching the autumn leaves scatter across my yard. I didn't rejoice at their suffering, I simply acknowledged it as the natural consequence of choices. Margaret used to tell me, "The world has a way of balancing itself, Alan." She was right. And now the balance was coming due, one overdue mortgage payment at a time. The courthouse steps were crowded that brisk November morning, a mix of real estate investors, curious townsfolk, and a handful of reporters sniffing out a story. I stood across the street in my black sedan, watching through the windshield as the county auctioneer unfolded his papers. His voice boomed over the crowd, steady and impersonal. "Property at 1247 Maple Avenue, four-bedroom colonial, opening bid $280,000. Kyle and Megan were there, of course." Megan's eyes were red, her voice hoarse from another night of screaming matches, but she clung to his arm as though her grip alone might stop the sale. Kyle's posture sagged under the weight of humiliation, yet he tried to muster a look of defiance. I recognized that stance. It was the same one he used as a teenager when caught in a lie, pretending he still held the upper hand. The first bid came quickly. A local contractor raised his hand, then another investor countered. Back and forth they went, numbers climbing in practiced rhythm. Megan's breathing quickened. "Stop this, Kyle. Do something," she hissed loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. I watched him glance nervously around the crowd, as though searching for a miracle. And then he found her, the woman in the navy suit, bidding confidently, without hesitation. Sarah Mitchell, my secretary, my trusted ally. She stood tall, her expression calm, raising her hand with precision at each increment. To the others, she looked like any determined buyer. But Kyle knew better the moment recognition dawned. "That's Dad's secretary," he whispered, panic cutting through his voice. Megan's head snapped toward her, then back at him. "He wouldn't. He couldn't," she said, though her tone carried no conviction. The bidding slowed as it neared the calculated figure Robert Chen and I had discussed. 317,000. Sarah's final bid. The gavel struck like a thunderclap. Sold. Megan's scream echoed off the courthouse walls. "This is our home, you can't take it." She tried to push past security towards Sarah, but a deputy blocked her path. Kyle's knees buckled. He sank onto the cold stone steps, burying his face in his hands. I stepped out of the sedan and walked across the street. Conversations hushed as I approached. When Kyle looked up and saw me, the color drained from his face. He understood. Every delay, every withdrawal, every signature it had all led here. "How could you do this to us?" he rasped, his voice breaking. I stopped a few feet away, my hands resting calmly on my cane. "I didn't do anything, Kyle. The bank did. Actions have consequences. You ignored your responsibilities, and now you live with the result." Megan lunged forward, eyes blazing. "You're a monster. You ruined us." "No." I corrected gently, almost sadly. "You ruined yourselves." I simply stepped aside and let it happen. The deputies kept them back as I turned away. Sarah met me at the edge of the crowd, the deed already in her hands. She nodded once, discreet but firm, then walked with me back toward the car. The house they had flaunted for years was no longer theirs. It belonged to Mitchell Holdings, a name that meant nothing to the public, but everything to me. Justice, at last, was in motion. The weeks after the foreclosure auction were cruel to Kyle, though not nearly as cruel as the words that came from his own wife. Megan had always loved the stage lights of Davenport Society charity luncheons, boutique shopping trips, weekends at the club. But when those lights went dark, she had no patience for living in the shadows. I heard about the first cracks from a former neighbor who spotted them at a pawn shop. Megan was selling jewelry pieces Margaret had once admired at their wedding, just to scrape together enough to pay utility bills. Kyle stood beside her, his shoulders slumped while the clerk counted cash with bored indifference. It was a sight no one in town would forget. Soon after their electricity was shut off. The gleaming colonial, where they had once hosted parties, now sat dark at night, candles flickering through the windows like a cruel parody of celebration. Davenport was a small town, and people talked. "They're finished," I overheard at the diner, living off credit cards until even those ran out. But it wasn't the foreclosure or the humiliation that truly broke Kyle. It was Megan. One cold December evening, she walked out. I didn't hear it from him. I heard it from the same neighbor who had seen her leave suitcases piled into the back of a black sedan, driven by a man she called by his first name. An ex-boyfriend, a restaurant owner who still had money, still had reputation. The words she left Kyle with, according to the neighbor, cut like a knife. "I married into a wealthy family, not this." When I finally saw Kyle days later, his appearance shocked me. He was thinner, his eyes hollow, his once pristine clothes now wrinkled and stained. He stood in line at the Morning Glory diner, wearing the uniform of a short-order cook waiting to clock in. For years, he had carried himself as the heir to Foster Construction. Now he shuffled with the weary posture of a man half beaten into the ground. I ordered coffee and took a seat at the counter. Our eyes met, and for the first time he didn't smirk, didn't demand, didn't manipulate. He simply looked away, shame flooding his face. Later that night, sitting alone in my living room, I thought of Margaret's note. I hoped that was enough. She had worried Kyle only loved what we could give him. Now, stripped of home wealth and even his marriage, the answer was clear. But I felt no triumph, only a somber sense of balance. The world had finally held him accountable in ways I never could, and as I set Margaret's Bible back on the mantel, I whispered into the quiet, "He's reaping what he sowed, Margaret." And I didn't have to lift a hand. It was a cold November evening when I saw his shadow through the frosted glass of my front door. For nearly a full minute, the outline lingered, shoulders slumped, hand hovering near the bell, as though pressing it required more strength than he had left. When I finally opened the door, Kyle stood before me, unshaven, gaunt, his once broad frame reduced by stress and poor meals. His jeans were wrinkled, his shirt stained, and his eyes hollowed from sleepless nights. "Dad," he croaked, his voice unsteady. I need to talk." I didn't invite him in. I simply leaned against the doorframe, waiting. He began with a rehearsed speech about how he had seen the light, how losing everything had made him realize what really mattered. He told me Megan had left, that he was working in a gas station for minimum wage, that his life had crumbled into ashes. "I've learned my lesson," he insisted, voice breaking. "I know I failed Mom, but I want to make it right. I want to be the son she wanted me to be." His words might have swayed me once, but I had lived too long under the weight of his manipulation to take them at face value. I looked him in the eye and asked softly, "When is your mother's birthday?" He blinked, startled. June 15th, my heart clenched. Wrong. "What was her favorite flower?" "Roses," he answered quickly. Again, wrong. Margaret adored daisies, simple and unassuming the way she lived her life. I shook my head slowly. "You don't even know the basics, Kyle. Not her birthday. Not her favorite flower. Do you realize what that means? You never really knew your mother at all. You only knew what she could give you." For the first time, his mask dropped completely. The false humility vanished, replaced by frustration. "This is ridiculous. Just tell me what you want me to say." "I'm here, aren't I?" I admitted I messed up. Isn't that enough? I stepped back into the doorway and retrieved Margaret's hidden journal from the table behind me. Flipping it open, I read aloud, "I'm worried Kyle only loves our money. What if we raised a child who cannot love his face?" Went pale. He stammered, She didn't mean that. She meant every word I said firmly, and she died knowing it was true." He clenched his fists, his voice rising in anger. "If she changed her will, if you changed everything, I'll contest it. I'll prove you're senile, that you manipulated her. You think this is over, but it's not. You'll regret leaving me with nothing." I held the journal against my chest, steady and calm. "No, Kyle. The only thing I regret is that we gave you everything and taught you nothing." His final words, spat like venom, echoed into the night. "I hope you die alone in this house." I closed the door quietly as he pounded on it, the sound dull against the thick wood. Then I walked to the kitchen, set the kettle on the stove, and made tea. For the first time in decades, I felt no fear of his absence, only peace in the truth. The night after Kyle's outburst, I sat at my desk with Margaret's journal open before me. Her words on the yellowed pages were no longer just memories. They were marching orders. She had seen what I refused to admit, that we had raised a son who could take endlessly but never give. If love had been measured in dollars, Kyle would have been rich beyond imagination. But true love, that was a currency he had never learned to spend. At sunrise, I walked into Robert Chen's office carrying my leather briefcase. Inside were Margaret's will, our financial statements, and the documents I had been preparing with him for weeks. Robert looked up, his face solemn. "Alan," he said, "are you certain this will cut Kyle out entirely? Once signed, there's no going back." I met his eyes with a calm I hadn't felt in months. "I've never been more certain of anything. My wealth, my home, my company, they will all serve a greater purpose. Margaret deserves that legacy, not Kyle." Together we finalized the Margaret Foster Memorial Foundation. Every asset from my business, shares to investment accounts, was moved into an irrevocable trust. Education scholarships for underprivileged children, funding for cancer research, community support programs, all the things Margaret had cared about in life would continue through her name. I signed the last page with a steady hand, feeling decades of weight lift off my shoulders. When Robert slid the notarized documents across the desk, I placed them neatly back into the briefcase. "I want Kyle notified formally," I said. "No ambiguity, no loopholes. He is excluded from my will and all future claims." Robert nodded his admiration undisguised. "Margaret would be proud. You've turned grief into something lasting." That evening, I returned home to the silence that had once felt suffocating. Now it felt purposeful. I stood in the garden trimming the rose bushes Margaret had loved. The air was cool, the sky streaked with orange and pink, and for the first time since her passing, I felt peace rather than emptiness. A week later, I attended the dedication of the Foundation's first project, a scholarship fund for nursing students. One of the recipients, a young woman named Sarah Patterson, clutched her award letter with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Foster," she said softly, "this means I can finally afford school. Please thank Mrs. Foster for me." I smiled, my throat tight. "She'd be the one thanking you. You're keeping her spirit alive." The applause that followed wasn't for me. It was for Margaret, for the love and sacrifice she had poured into others, even when her own son could not. As I walked away from the podium, I thought of Kyle. Word around town said he was working nights at a gas station, living in a small apartment above a laundromat. Megan had remarried, leaving him behind. His name was spoken now only with pity or disdain, but I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. The lesson had been delivered by life itself. At home that night, I placed fresh daisies, Margaret's favorite, on the mantel. "It's finished, my love," I whispered. "Justice is served. Your legacy is safe." And for the first time since her funeral, I slept soundly, dreaming not of loss, but of Margaret's smile. Looking back now, I understand that justice doesn't always come with thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes in silence, through choices, through boundaries, through the courage to say enough. My wife Margaret gave everything she had to our son, and in the end, he chose a birthday party over her funeral. That was the day I realized, love without respect isn't love at all, it's dependency, and dependency destroys families. When I cut Kyle off, I wasn't being cruel. I was giving him what Margaret and I should have given years earlier: responsibility. And though he lost his house, his wealth, and even his marriage, I don't take satisfaction in his pain. The satisfaction comes from knowing Margaret's legacy lives on, not in spoiled entitlement, but in scholarships for young students in cancer research, and in the lives touched by the foundation bearing her name. If there's one lesson in this story, it's this: sacrifice without gratitude breeds ruin. Parents must teach not only by giving, but by knowing when to stop giving. True love means guiding our children toward responsibility, even if it hurts. Now I want to ask you, have you ever sacrificed for family, only to feel your efforts were taken for granted? How did you handle it, and what did you learn? Share your story in the comments. If this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for listening, and may we all honor those who truly deserve our love.